Narcissistic behaviour and gaslighting are rife in the legal industry.
They've had an ego bruise, they will destroy you.
Do you think this is a contributing factor to toxicity within law firms?
There are so many dynamics which occur in law firms, which unfortunately can encourage one of the greatest hallmarks that we put as being narcissistic behaviour.
I just don't understand why people would go to that extent.
They will destroy people's careers, potentially smear them enough within the industry that it may make it difficult for them to get jobs. And yes, I have seen that happen.
But why would they do that?
It was a power game to try and make me miss bedtime, which I did. I missed it more often than not.
Today I'm talking with Alana Tart. She is a fractional general counsel for SMEs and an executive coach and mindfulness teacher. Alana has told me that she understands gaslighting and narcissistic patterns intimately. She grew up around these behaviours, and in most of her workplaces they have been accepted, if not rewarded. We came to the conclusion that a lot of lawyers, parents, are either narcissists or display narcissistic behaviours, and we were trying to work out, why is this?
One of the more difficult experiences for me as a very young associate was watching two partners in particular just continue to verbally eviscerate one of my colleagues. The reason I understand this topic too intimately is because this has been my life.
Alana first caught my attention through her LinkedIn post about narcissistic behaviour within and out of law. It got me thinking, no one else is really talking about this topic within the context of law, yet everyone knows that this behaviour is tolerated and even cultivated. Just touching on the feedback part, do you think that is a form of gaslighting in a way?
Gaslighting is just so prevalent in our culture.
In this conversation, we get into the nitty-gritty of narcissistic behaviour in the legal industry, the psychology behind it, and how lawyers can recognise it and become almost immune to it whilst keeping their career intact.
Underneath all of this is a tiny child who doesn't feel any worth at all.
I must admit this is a longer episode than I would normally publish. However, I strongly believe that so many of you listening will not only resonate with what we talk about, but will also find it highly valuable. Alana, so in one of your posts, you mentioned that narcissists lack felt empathy. I think it's fair to say that we find a lot of narcissistic behaviour within law. Do you think this is a contributing factor to toxicity within law firms?
Okay, so why don't we just start with what we mean by felt versus cognitive empathy? And I think we'll get to the second question with a yes. So cognitive versus felt empathy. Cognitive empathy is very analytical, and it's not actually heartfelt. Why this is an area where lawyers can be particularly proficient at is we are phenomenal analysts. In fact, we are paid for our critical thinking. We are paid to look at problems in a non-felt, non-emotional way. And so therefore, we're encouraged to apply, we can easily be encouraged to apply that beyond just our legal problems and indeed apply that to people. That's cognitive empathy. The problem when you divorce felt empathy, which we would call more real empathy, from the actual cognitive empathy, is you can easily move into what is true manipulation territory. Suddenly, these individuals that you're understanding, you're not really connecting with them. They can easily become tools, pawns in a game.
That's actually really interesting what you say about cognitive being thought and this is what I should and should not say type of thing. Whereas, I guess, what's the other type of it? Felt empathy is coming from the heart. And as lawyers, like you say, we are taught to not think about emotion necessarily in transactions, and look at different points of view and different arguments and angles, and not really feel things.
There's a lot of other things as well within the culture of law firms that can often contribute to it. And we'll go even before law firms. So, right. So getting into law school, that can be highly competitive. Getting your training contract, highly competitive. For your listeners outside of the UK, Canada jurisdictions where you have training contracts or articling students, the competition is a little bit more at the getting into law school phase. But regardless, you're looking at cultures that are emphasizing individualism and competition over a more collective thinking and compassion. And often these environments do then pit people as some being more superior or inferior, whether it has to do with your grades or how many hours you manage to bill, etc. Then, if you have that, people going numb, people being in these environments which are discouraging a more empathetic viewpoint, you then can have some poor treatment that goes on in them. Unfortunately, so many of us have seen it. I mean, one of the more difficult experiences for me as a very young associate was watching two partners in particular just continue to verbally eviscerate one of my colleagues. And repeated exposure to things like that, repeated exposure to callousness often breeds apathy. And if you're emotionally numb because you're working too hard, that also is going to continue with the apathy. And then you get cognitive dissonance, where suddenly you are in the situation where you're not agreeing with the way that partners are treating your fellow colleagues. You feel completely powerless to be doing anything about it. You have gone into this job having worked to get so hard to get there. So you've got conflicting actions, beliefs, and feelings, and you'll often reduce your empathy to even just resolve that conflict. Are you getting the point that there are so many dynamics which occur in law firms, which unfortunately can encourage one of the greatest hallmarks that we put as being what we call narcissistic behavior, which is a lowered amount of empathy?
To be honest, it's only now, because at the time when I was working in law and in law school, etc., I didn't know what narcissism or narcissistic behavior was at all. You know, it wasn't really something that I honestly thought that when people said, oh, this person's a narcissist, I thought, oh, that means that they love themselves. Like they're obsessed with themselves. I didn't know that it actually caused harm to people and that their behavior could impact other people. I was not aware of this, but it's only now when I see your posts and I talk with other people and I inform myself about the topic that I realize how actually harmful it can be to other people and culture. And if you're in the presence of someone who's, you know, exercising narcissistic behavior, it can seriously affect you in a highly negative way. Do you have any experiences with narcissistic behavior within law?
So I'm going to go back before law, because the reason I understand this topic too intimately is because this has been my life. This is my family. I was fortunate or unfortunate to adopt the role of taking a side. So I became my mother's protector. That bizarrely equaled I protected me, because I then didn't engage with a lot of the things which often can fuel a narcissistic engagement. And one of the main things that narcissists often use, although you don't have to be a narcissist to use it, is gaslighting. And that was pretty much most interactions with my extended family. So I grew up with this as most of the behaviors, and I grew up in this strange outside position of always observing it. That then meant I started reading and eating up an enormous volume of literature on this area, of which at that point in time, it was just emerging as a personality disorder. And I have to say that made no sense to me. because the personality disorder suggests that an individual is to have a disorder, you often have yourself have to be harmed by it. And I wasn't seeing that my extended family was being harmed. Quite the opposite. I was seeing them very vindictively go after my mother, and I'm very happy to tell stories, but I think the story that connects that to law, to go back to what you were asking. So my first exposure within law was using the law. So I am related to lawyers. And one of the things that someone who has narcissistic tendencies struggles with is when they feel they've had an ego insult. So something which doesn't align with their vision of themselves or how they would like others to perceive them. Now, my mother is one of 5, and she's the only daughter. And for some reason, my grandmother, who I believe herself was narcissistic, made my mother an executor with no protection. The executor of the estate with no protection. That then led to 11 years of litigation, of which none of it quite qualified enough to get up to the vexatious line. Because that's the thing, a lot of narcissists are so shrewd. When we talk about having bullying behavior in the workplace, we'll say document, document, document. Well, it's very difficult to keep documenting things which fall just below the line. It was the same thing. Either the cases would get pulled and then another one would come. And that litigation didn't just cost. So that was using the courts as a tool of manipulation and control. I eventually became the default instructor of the counsel on my mother's side because I was the only one who seemed to be able to out chessmate a lot of the others. But it didn't prevent it costing, draining her entire inheritance, which is what they wanted. And that's unfortunately, when you get to an extreme end of narcissism, they will want to absolutely, through their vindictiveness, destroy. So you will see this in workplaces when you have individuals who are on the far end of the narcissistic scale, or in terms of their behavior patterns, and they've had an ego bruise, they will destroy you. They will work to get you out of that job. They may do giant smear campaigns. They will generally be in a position of power, and so they'll manage to get HR on their side. In fact, HR more often than not is there to protect the company, protect those higher up in the hierarchy, but they'll do it all within enough of the books that you wouldn't have a sufficient case to bring against them. And so they will then destroy people's careers and potentially smear them enough within the industry that it may make it difficult for them to get further jobs. And yes, I have seen that happen.
That's kind of happened to me, but on a smaller scale, not as extreme as what you're saying. That's terrible. Where does narcissistic behavior come from? I know it comes from probably like childhood.
When we had a lot of emphasis on narcissistic personality disorder, there was a lot of emphasis on it being an attachment rupture. Now it seems to be, and look, this area keeps moving, right? So I may sit here and may talk about it, and you may ask me for a perfect definition, and I will struggle because it does keep moving and it keeps evolving, as does most areas having to do with humans, right? We're complex beasts. So we don't have a definitive list in terms of like a tick box, which will equal these people will become narcissists because of X, Y, Z. You could have people from the same family who become narcissists and some don't. I personally believe, given that I spoke about my family, my grandmother worshipped men and considered females to be her competitors. And that worshiping created this like sense of entitlement from an extremely early age amongst my extended family. And so that doesn't help. And that's been one of the things that has been documented. But there's so many ways that people can become. And one of the questions, I'll answer a question that you haven't asked, but one of the questions that people have struggled with is, can you help those who have narcissistic tendencies, particularly those who are on the further side of the spectrum and really struggling with empathy and able to connect? And the answer is a maybe. And the maybe is because they found that individuals who are that far have to have the willingness to do three things. And these are all big hurdles. One, have a recognition that they need to take some action and a commitment to do so. That in itself is a big hurdle because these are individuals that tend to be incredibly adept and insightful socially. That's the cognitive empathy, but not have a lot of self-awareness, right? So something has to happen, which has finally led them to, instead of vindictively retaliating, decide they wanted to make a change. Two, they then, and here again comes in my new areas of expertise, they need to be able to engage in types of therapeutic processes which usually include mindfulness. And they can find that really, really hard. And then three, once they've gone through all those layers of therapy, including spending time with mindfulness, they have to get down to the one of the bottom layers, which is an empty hole, a really facing the deep sense of lack of worth that they have underneath all of that. So if you're asking where it comes from, deep, deep underneath this, there still is the belief that underneath all of this is a tiny child who doesn't, and it may not be a child, but it's easy to envisage it as one who doesn't feel any worth at all.
I feel like we've really got into a topic here. It's like so many layers, you know. I'm on a mission to help lawyers realise that there's another way. They don't have to practice law in the traditional way. We're not all made to work in an office. Some people want to travel and work. Some people want to be their own bosses. Others want a side business. So with this, I want to ask you for 2 favours. Please leave a review on whichever podcast platform you're using. And secondly, please share this episode with at least one friend who you think would benefit from it. I don't know if you agree with this, but I've had a few conversations with people who are lawyers, and we came to the conclusion that a lot of lawyers' parents are either narcissists or display narcissistic behaviours, and we were trying to work out, why is this? And I just wonder whether it's the parents who are, let's say you've got a parent and they're a narcissist, and they're pushing their child to become a lawyer because it's a prestigious profession, because they want it to reflect well or better on them so they can go and tell everyone, you know. Do you think that's the case?
I don't know if there's like statistically a large number of lawyers who have narcissistic parents, but the behavior you just described of a parent wanting a child to do something so that parent looked good, the image management, the real concentration on status and image, that is a narcissistic behavior.
Is it possible to display parts of narcissistic behavior but not actually be a narcissist?
Absolutely. I listed for you at the beginning ways that within law firms we can get to the point where people's empathy levels go down. And you do not have to be narcissistic have many of the other characteristics for that to happen. I know so many people who get emotionally numb, and not just in law, in finance, in medicine, and that emotional numbness will dissociate themselves from themselves as well as from other people. And that itself can lead to behavior patterns that maybe not really true to who they are at all.
You mentioned gaslighting being one of them. You know, this is a trait that people can have. And before we started recording, you mentioned that pretty much most people gaslight people. I know that I have. Not in, you know, like a malicious or manipulative way. How do you think gaslighting can manifest in the hierarchical structure of a law firm? And what signs should employees watch out for in those situations?
Okay, so just so everybody is clear, because not everybody knows what the term gaslighting means, gaslighting is actually a relationship, right? It takes two. It takes an individual, the gaslighter, who needs to be right, And in order to continue to preserve their sense of self and power, they then try and impose or bring others into their version of reality, which they truly often do deem to be right. But really, it's just a perception. And then you need a gaslightee who may not originally willingly buy into that other individual's reality, but they want to be seen in a certain way. So, for example, a gaslighter, because it often, and this goes into your question about hierarchy, you will often find that this happens in power structures, and a hierarchy by its nature is a power structure. And more often than not, in fact, almost always, the gaslighter is the one who's in the power position. So let's say a partner in a law firm, right? The gaslightee could be an associate, and they want to be considered worthy of their job. They want to be approved of. In fact, we'll find a lot of lawyers you'll find are people pleasers. And so they'll automatically easily slide into the position of, because they want to be seen in a certain way, of giving gas to the gaslighting, right? So it takes two as a start. Now, can I give you an example and then fully answer because that may help as well, then fully answer your hierarchy question? Okay, I think this is one I've seen, and I feel it's a fairly relatable one. So if we can all put ourselves back to when we were associates, because all of us at one time were, even if we're not anymore, I'm sure all of us at times were given unrealistic deadlines. And those unrealistic deadlines may have come because a partner made a promise to the client. Now, that partner could either believe that the work could be done within that time, but in particular, they will want to avoid a difficult conversation with that client, particularly having to admit that maybe they haven't managed this project perfectly. So instead of the partner admitting that to themselves or to a client, they will tell the associate that any issues to non-delivery are based on poor time management skills. And each partner may even go as far, and I have heard this, as telling the client, if the work wasn't delivered on time, this associate will not work on your matters again. Now, that's the gaslighting, okay? Because the gaslighting is the reality that the partner wants people to buy into is that this project wasn't delivered on time because of that associate's poor time management, right? How does the associate respond? Well, often they may first start to defend themselves, saying that the work really required more time than was originally promised to the client. They may try and give examples of all that's required in terms of doing the task. They are engaging in the gaslighting. They're so desperate to not be interpreted as poor with time that they're engaging, right? They're trying to change that partner's mind about them, the behavior the partner has attributed to them. And often, this is one which which most of us can look back on and see, and I think you've mentioned this at times, that associate will then ruminate. They'll play back those conversations over and over again in their head, going, oh my goodness, was the partner right? What did I do wrong? Okay. In order to not play the role of gaslightee, you need to stop, pause that rumination and say, wait a minute, like, it does not matter who's right here. That's super, super hard when you're caring about what that partner thinks of you. Then once you're defending yourself, that partner may respond, well, look, I don't think you can take constructive feedback. You're clearly too sensitive, too emotional. You're not cut out for law. Furthermore, if you really wanted this career, you would be grateful for the projects that you've been given and ensure they're done on time. That associate may go to the associates committee or in an organization, go to HR, and then be told things like, well, you just have to learn how to effectively manage upward, or you need to work harder on relationships with partners, or they may not want to give you work anymore. See how that's like even further gaslighting. And often you will find, particularly in corporates or very big law firms, the systems that you may be told there to support you, they're there to support the highest in the chain and either undermine or dismiss other perceptions. So then the associate starts second guessing himself. They're like further ruminating. Oh my gosh, am I not just poor time management and I'm actually too sensitive? And they start feeling destabilized and they start apologizing and they think, oh, wow, what this partner thinks about me is probably right. I really am not cut out for law. If I did care about it, I would have got all these projects done on time. I don't deserve this job. Yeah. Like you see how this whole thing progressed as a really unpleasant place. And it can get to the point where that associate loses their whole motivation, the whole joy. They start even to lose their sense of self. Their performance declines, which unfortunately then confirms the position of the first partner. And they just start entering this cloud of hopelessness, thinking that everything has to do something wrong with them, either their abilities, their character, or feelings. Do you see how this is not a disagreement, right? This is not a disagreement. This is about undermining another individual's reality that makes the gaslightee second guess himself.
I feel like probably most people can resonate with this, in that position. I definitely can. There's been multiple situations, and I kind of thought that was kind of normal, that dynamic. And then you can go through your career thinking that, yeah, it is pretty normal to have those doubts. And it also taps into imposter syndrome as well, because it can fuel that. And then you can start really, really doubting yourself. And it's a terrible situation to be in. Yeah, it's awful.
And you asked about hierarchy. That power imbalance in terms of the relationship, which is protected by hierarchical structures, usually allows a gaslighter to undermine the gaslightee's sense of self. So it permits the interaction I just described to go on. In fact, as I suggested, whether it be the associates committee or HR, they will protect it.
I've definitely had this before where, you go to HR and you're actually too scared to tell them the truth because you know that their vested interest is to protect those at the top, which is not good, really.
And unfortunately, because these behaviors are so, like gaslighting is just so prevalent in our culture, it's not a compliance, it's not a grievance issue. So, I mean, another good example, I said in that one that the associate was accused of not being able to take feedback. Well, let's just think about how feedback normally works, right? We have this, and we're not going to get rid of feedback. It is part of HR processes and it's deeply entrenched. And there are times it's shown that having 360 feedback can help people with narcissistic tendencies be less narcissistic. But most organizations treat feedback as it's an objective truth for the individual who's lower on the hierarchy chain to work on to improve. Do you get how that's already by definition gaslighting? Because it isn't an objective truth. And then the debate on feedback becomes over the real truth, which is then the gaslightee doing the first defense part and playing their role. When actually, feedback only actually tells you two things. One, how your behavior is perceived by another person, because feedback is a story, it's an opinion. And two, and this is why it is important, your level of influence within an organization, because how you're perceived does correlate often to the amount of influence. And that can be super important for you to understand, because ultimately influence in itself is power. And if you're trying to navigate your way through a difficult workplace environment, the less power you have, the less leverage you have to actually find your way through it within that organization and maybe move yourself, for example, under a different partner in a law firm or to a different functional area within an organization.
Just touching on the feedback part, I think that gaslighting can be used as a tactic, as you've mentioned, to seem like it's feedback, but it's actually making people doubt themselves, question themselves, which is awful. What about if someone, because this has happened to me, where you're given feedback, but it's kind of collected over a period of time and little incidents have been put onto, a form or whatever. Then 6 months down the line, they're like, you did this 5 months ago, you did this 4 months ago. Da, 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 da. It's like, why have you not told me at the time? I wasn't aware of it, and now I've forgotten about it and I can't correct it because it's already happened. Do you think that is a form of gaslighting in a way?
If it's then used, so gaslighting again is to try and bring someone else into your reality. So if that individual has used all those bullet points in order to create a reality which they then want you to agree with, yes.
Right. Oh my gosh, I've been gaslit.
Everybody has. Like, it just happens all the time. And when we taught, and like, the only true feedback there is here, I'm going to give you an example, Holly. And just for anybody listening, I have completely made this example up. Okay. This is no reflection on anything. Okay. So, Holly, let's say I come to you and say, you know what, Holly? Many people might come to me and they're saying that you're too much and you need to tone it down. Okay, so there's the feedback, right? Now, that's completely inaccurate feedback. What is accurate feedback is for me to say, Holly, when I'm with you, I feel that you have this real presence. It's an energy around you. Sometimes it's really great. I can feel how it lifts up to the room. But there are times that I feel what you say is not the most appropriate for the situation, such as when you give so many details about what happened on the weekend. My emotional reaction is one of anger and annoyance because I like my workplace to be a certain way where we have a greater divide between the personal and the professional. I'm concerned that there may be others who have a similar reaction to me. I don't know, but worth keeping your eyes out for, and that this may diminish your influence and therefore your ability to progress. Do you see the difference in terms of those two? The first one is just some kind of opinion story. The second one is me telling you, this is my perception. This is the exact behavior I'm reacting to. Here's my reaction. And on top of that, here's my emotional reaction. I could have gone even further and said, I feel anger and annoyance, and where I'm feeling it often is in my chest. And I'm finding that hard to even get some control over, because then it feels right. But that's actually talking about being an embodied person, which we've already touched on is a little bit more difficult for those on the analytical bend. That's the only accurate feedback people can give. And that is not the feedback that most people are ever trained to give.
Yeah.
And by the way, this whole like too much, I have so many clients, so many coaching clients who are told that. And it's often a translation for, you're making me feel uncomfortable and I feel threatened because you're taking up more space. And what one of the quotes that I love to say is from the Mad Hatter in Alice in Wonderland. And he says to Alice, he says something along the lines of, and I'm going to paraphrase this, but it's like, you used to be much more, much, muchier, and you've lost that muchness. And he seems to be referring in Alice to like the qualities that she had at the beginning of the story, her curiosity, her imagination, her boldness, that diminished over time. And as it did, so did her richness and her zest for life. So really, muchness symbolizes one's personality and their authenticity. So when someone is coming to you and saying you're too much, they're struggling with authenticity.
I love that quote from Alice in Wonderland. It's such a good one. What can someone do then? Let's say you're in that situation, and it's a very tricky situation to be in as the gaslightee or as the employee, because, if you're dealing with your boss, you can't really turn around and say, well, you'd never say this, but I'd love to say it. You're gaslighting me. Can we like take a step back and think about what you're saying here? I'd love to say that. How do you approach this situation as an employee?
Okay, it's great. Such a good question. And absolutely do not ever call someone a narcissist or say they're gaslighting you. That's not going to help your career. But validate how you feel, right? Like, validate it with yourself. I sometimes even tell people, if they need to, just go outside and scream, and with your non-dominant hand and a crayon, just like write the word F. Like, just I didn't swear because I don't know if I can swear on this podcast, but just like validate it, because don't gaslight yourself. Don't try and analyze, explain away their behavior. You can be compassionate for the person without actually excusing the behavior. So that's like the first one. Actually validate how you feel, which for those who are in law firms that are working too many hours and have gone numb, that's pretty hard because you don't always know how you feel. You pushed all of that away, and you probably pushed the ability to feel anger away too. But, to the extent you can feel and validate it. Don't dismiss it. 2, do not negotiate your reality or your worth. Now, this is really, really hard because we're in a job and we want people to appreciate us, but we don't need them to validate that we have value. And that actually does take a lot of hard work. I was only able to do this as a child because I took a side and I chose to believe one of the sides, which forced me to believe a different reality than the gaslighters. So I wasn't actually a super strong, amazing 4-year-old. I actually just was fortunate in I couldn't believe the reality being pushed by the gaslighters because I adopted a different one. And that's the same thing here. You cannot give someone the power to determine your worth. Don't ask who's right. Just ask yourself how you want to be treated. By engaging in this debate of whether that person is right or not, you are participating in the gaslighting relationship and giving it gas. Big one, and again, I'll go back to this is like an absolutely core part of my coaching program, and one of the big reasons why I trained as a mindfulness teacher as well as have my full coaching qualification: emotional intelligence and regulation. Truly, those are the kryptonite for gaslighting, either as someone who is a gaslighter or a gaslightee. True kryptonite. So anything you can do in those areas are superpower strengths. And finally, allow your real self-trust to be your compass, your light in the darkness. None of that, by the way, is easy for most people.
I was literally about to say that. I think before we spoke, we were messaging and you said to me, you have a fairly good awareness of gaslighting and narcissistic behaviour. And I honestly think I've probably got about, on a scale of like 1 to 10, I feel like my awareness is about a 4. It's not, I don't feel like I know that much, but I do from speaking to you. And I just feel like when I was in law, I said to you, I didn't have the luxury of having that awareness. My awareness was 0, right? So I think that one piece of protection or armor that people can have when they're working in this industry, or even if they're dealing with narcissistic behavior, outside of the industry or anywhere else, is having that awareness of how people are treating you and understanding how to deal with that and what to say to yourself. Because as you literally just said, one of the biggest problems is people treat you in a certain way and then you start telling yourself certain things and it makes it 10 times worse. And I think if you start speaking to yourself in the right way, that's going to be a massive help. Would that be right?
100%. I agree with you. And that's why also self-compassion is a really big part of my coaching. And that sounds nice and wishy-washy and weak. Oh my gosh, it's not. It is one of the strongest things that you can be is compassionate, particularly to yourself. And the great thing about self-compassion and self-acceptance is that it spreads. Once you really get to a point where you fully accept yourself. And here's another thing, Holly, which so many people don't talk about a lot. And I'm glad we're calling these narcissistic tendencies. And we've agreed that gaslighting is everywhere and we are all susceptible to be it. You need, in order to have real self-acceptance, you need to be able to put up a mirror in front of yourself and see where it is that you are also exercising some of these behaviors that you've decided to label as toxic. And that's why, I use the word toxic in what I write because people understand it, but I try really, really hard to not make it an othering. We have to see how these things are in all of us, in ourselves. And real self-acceptance is that. And the amazing thing, when you get to the point of accepting your whole self and no longer seeing these parts of yourself as a real flaw, and I'm going to get to that in just a second, then you're actually really able to give that to the world. It has that beautiful, beautiful ripple effect. So it's a shield and it helps others. And that again goes into that kryptonite. Now, the reason I said not a flaw is because of this. And this is where people who are on the narcissistic end have that, remember we talked about that core of worthlessness and haven't been able to get to do that work. It's exceptionally hard for them because they will, accepting that part of themselves, giving themselves that love that they need, really difficult, really difficult. But for those who've managed to get through the process, whether you have narcissistic tendencies that are strong or not, and get to that, you will start recognizing that some of these behaviors that we label as toxic, you need to have, and you need to adopt them, and you need to be able to exercise them in a compassionate way. A super easy example is ruthlessness. A ruthless person who acts with narcissistic tendencies is destructive, truly destructive. They will not care about anything in their wake that they might destroy on the path of using their ruthlessness, usually within their own ascent in power. Whereas you show me a parent who truly isn't ruthless. We don't exist. I am a ruthless mother. Absolutely. If something's going to harm my children, of course I'm going to act ruthlessly, and I should. If I deny that part of myself and push it away and say that's a bad character trait to have because it means I'm narcissistic, I am denying my children part of the care and protection that they need from their parent.
So it's about just accepting different parts of you. And how do you go about, and this is probably a complicated answer, but how do you go about looking at yourself in a mirror and finding those different parts to you?
So why, for those who spend a good amount of time with me as a coach, I do usually start our coaching relationship with helping people reconnect to what might be called their essence. Some people call these like core values. I don't have that same belief. I think we all have a whole bunch of values, including conflicting ones. I just told you how in certain circumstances, I have a high value toward ruthlessness, right? And that's going to conflict by my also high value around decency, kindness, and fairness, right? Each of us does have parts of ourselves which we often have started to not fully be connected to. And so we start our coaching relationship regaining that and re-bringing into the fold some of the parts of ourselves, including the parts that are muchness, right? That others may have rejected because they're quote unquote too much, including those parts and bringing them back in and working to have the emotional intelligence and the compassion so that we start able to accept them. And then we'll start working on what are the things that really repel you in this world? Like, what do you really makes you angry? And we'll start working through how often those things that are more difficult for us, we have judged as more difficult for ourselves, we start looking at, okay, well, let's actually look at that. What are the parts in it do you actually really admire? What are the parts that you may have in yourself, but often that's a harder leap? And what are the parts within that person who you just think is horrible to be around that you may need for yourself? So let's take arrogance, which is one of the characteristics often associated with narcissism. Well, arrogance often also involves some level of ostentatiousness and selfishness to the extent of disregarding others. A lot of people who have high people-pleasing tendencies can find arrogance very difficult. But what do those people actually need? They need to be standing up for themselves more. They need to be more selfish because they need better self-care. And so by starting to look at, actually, I may be triggered by people who show that character trait because either it's already within me and I'm denying it, or because it's a behavior that I need, then we can bring a lot more of these behaviors back into the fold.
I just want to change the subject slightly and go back to our original conversation at the beginning of this episode, because I want to just ask you a final question about, in my experience within the industry, within law, I found that the culture was really a culture that cultivated narcissistic behavior and gaslighting, as we've mentioned. Would you say that these factors do play a role in cultivating such a toxic culture, similar, I guess, to the first question that I asked you?
Yeah, they will do. I mean, let's just look at what gets rewarded within law firms, right? Where does the power balance really lay? It lays with the heaviest rainmakers. That has nothing to do with care for associates or employees. Nothing. So you always have to look at what gets really rewarded. And what gets rewarded within law firms, unfortunately, is not how we treat each other. What can make a great rainmaker, and this is of no difference to the great rainmakers out there, but often many of the behaviors which are on the more narcissistic end can make an outstanding rainmaker.
In what way?
That cognitive empathy, really, charming, charismatic, high confidence. Those are all attributes we will more often than not associate with someone who has narcissistic tendencies. Really able to suck people in because they often do what's called love bombing. And so they will just make people feel very, very special. They can be bizarrely absolutely acute listeners. Now, they will take that information they get and they will use it to close the sale. But all of these really, I mean, they're phenomenally, bizarrely socially intelligent. They're just not a felt sense of social intelligence, right? And then often you'll also find that people who have more narcissistic tendencies are willing to bend some of the rules. So unfortunately, they're happy to backstab. They're happy to throw people under the bus, like that example I gave in terms of throwing the associate under the bus. They will do what it takes in order to retain the power, which in a law firm is having those high fee paying clients.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a real power game. I remember when I returned after my first child to law, I had a partner. And this was, this is now my daughter's 13. So we're talking a while back now. Hopefully some of the cultures have changed, but I left my house at 7:30 with a nanny there. All I wanted to do was just put her to bed in the evening, which required me, because of my commute time, to leave at 6 p.m. And this was known because I'd explained it. I was open. I was saying, look, here's how I'd be grateful to be able to work. I can log in when I get home. I don't mind continuing the work there. I just would love 20 minutes because I only get to see her for 20 minutes in the morning. So it'd be nice to have 20 minutes at night. And I had a partner who I did very little work for, but he would literally phone at 5 to 6. Hi, how are you doing, Alana? It was a power game to try and make me miss bedtime, which I did. I missed it more often than not. I then had another partner who was more senior, but he was nearing retirement. And so his power was waning because he was on the out. And that was known, right? And he had a daughter who had his first grandchild the same time that my first child was born. And he'd come to my office at 5:45 and say, it's all clear, meaning I could use the service elevator near his office so I wouldn't have to pass through the floor. Now, that might be really kind of him, but did he stand up for what actually wasn't the greatest behavior on that office floor? Did he go and say, you know what, leave her alone, let her go home? It's not a problem. She's delivering great work still. No, he didn't, because he didn't have the power to do so.
But why would they do that? Like, what did he get out of? I know you're saying it's a power thing, but I just don't understand why people would go to that extent when they know that you wanted to spend that time, with your child. I don't understand it.
Well, we have to then go back to what the Kool-Aid of a lot of the law firms are, which is that you have contracted to give hours. Your worth is based on your hours. right? And there's bizarrely a low level of trust often within law firms. So there has traditionally been a lot of FaceTime, but I believe COVID considerably changed quite a lot of that from what I hear. That was simply to say, if you still want to be part of this culture, we need to see the dedication to the hours over and above anything else. I mean, I had a female partner as my mentor, and her advice to me was to get a night nanny as well as have a day nanny. Just outsource my entire parenting job. So I left when I left after my second child, and I left because I knew I never wanted to be on the partnership track, and I was getting the point I needed to start specializing. So why was I still there? And when I left, it was so ingrained into me to not talk about having kids because that was seen as a liability to my career that I struggled to do so in my in-house interviews.
Wow.
I avoided the topic.
That's terrible. It's such a shame. Most women, I'm generalizing here, but most women want children.
Why are we excluding allowing people to be their whole selves? And I don't mean bring your whole self to work in terms of show your underbelly, but we all have more to life than just what's going on in our work environment. And we're all the better for our work when we can lead a richer, more fulfilling life.
Alana is not only a lawyer, she is a certified UK counsellor and a trained mindfulness and compassion teacher. She has proven ways of both helping people become more immune to gaslighting and narcissism from others, and also understanding how they can reduce these tendencies in themselves. If you'd like to contact Alana, just go to the description of this podcast episode for more information. Law podcasts are notoriously boring. I plan to change that. I have analysed hundreds of law podcasts. I know what works, and I know why podcasts fail. If you're a senior lawyer with an engaged following and a mission, and you want to build a legacy and income streams through a top 1% podcast, then go to the description of this episode to find out how I can help you.